Have you ever looked up at the sky and seen a helicopter and just for a moment wondered about the person at the controls? Not just the pilot, but the person. What did they have for breakfast? Are they married? Do they have kids waiting for them at home? It's a fleeting thought, one that passes as quickly as the aircraft disappears over the horizon. We see the machine, a symbol of power and purpose, but we rarely see the heart that beats within it. Today, we're going to talk about a man who was the heart of one of the most advanced and revered flying machines in the world. He wasn't a celebrity, and his name isn't one you'd find in most history books. But for the elite of the elite, for the men who walked into the darkest corners of the world, he was their guardian angel in the sky. This is the story of Chief Warrant Officer 5 Bryan Nichols, one of the most respected pilots in the U.S. Army's legendary 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, the Night Stalkers. And this is the story of his final mission, a mission that has become a name whispered with a mixture of awe and profound sorrow. Extortion 17. It's a story about a man, a helicopter, and a single catastrophic moment that changed everything. Bryan Nichols' story begins not in the war-torn mountains of Afghanistan, but in the quiet, rolling hills of Hays, Kansas. He was born in 1964, a time when America was caught between the idyllic optimism of the post-war boom and the growing anxieties of the Cold War and Vietnam. It was a world of black and white television gradually giving way to color, a world where service to one's country was a deeply ingrained value, a thread woven into the fabric of communities just like Hays. His father had been a B-17 pilot in World War II, a man who had stared death in the face from the cockpit of a flying fortress. The tales of his father's service weren't just stories. They were a part of the family's DNA. They were lessons in courage, duty, and the quiet professionalism that defined that generation. Young Bryan grew up under the vast Kansas sky, a sky that seemed to stretch on forever, a perfect canvas for a boy's dreams of flight. He wasn't a flashy kid, not the one who demanded to be the center of attention. He was observant, thoughtful, and possessed a calm demeanor that would one day become his greatest asset. He graduated from Hays High School in 1982. The world then was a different place. The specter of Vietnam was beginning to fade, but the military was in a period of intense rebuilding and professionalization. It was an era that saw the birth of the modern Special Operations Forces, forged in the fires of failed missions like Operation Eagle Claw in Iran. The need for a new kind of military aviator, one who could fly in the most demanding conditions imaginable under the cover of absolute darkness, was becoming critically apparent. It was into this new world that a young man from Kansas, with a quiet confidence and a legacy of aviation in his blood, would soon step. Bryan enlisted in the Army in 1984. He didn't just want to be a soldier, he wanted to fly. He was accepted into the Warrant Officer Flight Training Program, a rigorous path designed to create technical experts and masters of their craft. This is where the boy from Kansas began to truly distinguish himself. Flying a helicopter isn't like driving a car. It's a constant three-dimensional dance with physics, a delicate balance of power, lift, and trust in your machine. And Bryan had a natural feel for it. He was what pilots call a natural stick. He didn't just operate the controls, he seemed to understand the very soul of the aircraft. After earning his wings, he served in various aviation units, including a tour in Germany. But Bryan was drawn to a higher calling. He heard whispers of an elite unit, a group of pilots who flew the most dangerous missions, in the most advanced helicopters, in total darkness. They were the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, the Night Stalkers, and their motto was, "Night Stalkers don't quit." Getting into the 160th is notoriously difficult. The selection and training process known as Green Platoon is designed to break you. It pushes pilots to their absolute physical and mental limits. They are tested on their ability to fly at treetop level, at night, using night vision goggles, in simulated combat conditions that would make most seasoned pilots balk. Many don't make it. The stress is immense. The standards are unforgiving. But Bryan's calm, methodical nature was perfectly suited for it. He didn't panic. He analyzed, he adapted, and he flew with a precision that was almost surgical. He was assigned to fly the MH-47 Chinook, the workhorse of Special Operations. These weren't your standard Chinooks. The 160th Chinooks are highly modified, packed with advanced avionics, defensive systems, and in-flight refueling capabilities. They are flying fortresses designed to carry operators deep behind enemy lines and bring them home safely. Bryan didn't just learn to fly the Chinook, he mastered it. Over the years, he rose through the ranks, eventually achieving the highest rank possible for a warrant officer, Chief Warrant Officer 5. This rank is reserved for the absolute masters of their technical field. A CW5 is a living repository of knowledge and experience, a quiet professional who has seen and done it all. Bryan became an instructor pilot, a standardization pilot, the one who sets the standard for all other pilots in the unit. He was the guy the young hotshot aviators looked up to with a sense of reverence. He had more than 8,000 flight hours, with over 3,000 of those flown in combat. Think about that for a moment. 3,000 hours spent flying in the dark, in the most dangerous places on Earth, with the lives of the nation's most valuable assets in the back of his helicopter. He deployed to Kuwait, Iraq, and Afghanistan countless times. He was part of the initial invasion of Iraq in 2003, flying missions that were critical to the war's opening days. One of the stories that circulated about Bryan, one that perfectly captures his character, had nothing to do with a dramatic firefight. He was flying a mission in Iraq, and a younger, less experienced pilot was on the controls. The weather turned unexpectedly, and the other pilots started to get overwhelmed. A dangerous situation in a loaded-down Chinook at low altitude. Bryan didn't grab the controls. He didn't raise his voice. He simply started talking, his voice a calm, steady presence in the younger pilot's headset. He talked him through the procedures, step by step, bleeding off the panic and allowing the other pilot to regain his composure and fly them safely out of danger. That was Bryan Nichols. He didn't just fly the helicopter, he flew the people inside it, including his own crew. He led with quiet confidence, not with bluster. He was a family man. He met his wife, Mary, and they built a life together. They had a son, Braden. For all the high-stakes missions and the secret life of a Night Stalker, his greatest joy was his family. He was a doting father, the kind of dad who was always there for school events and baseball games whenever he wasn't deployed. This was the duality of his life. One foot in the world of suburban American fatherhood, the other in the cockpit of a special operations helicopter, halfway across the world. It's a tension that few of us can comprehend, a constant balancing act between the ordinary and the extraordinary. In the summer of 2011, Bryan was nearing the end of a long and distinguished career. He had given more than 2 decades of his life to the Night Stalkers. He was 47 years old, a senior statesman in a young man's game. He was in Afghanistan, on what was likely to be one of his final deployments. The war had been raging for a decade. It was a grinding, relentless conflict, especially for the Special Operations community. The operational tempo was brutal. They were the tip of the spear, constantly in demand, constantly in danger. Just a few months earlier, in May of 2011, The world had learned the name of SEAL Team 6 after the successful raid that killed Osama bin Laden. The Night Stalkers had flown that mission, delivering the SEALs to their target in Abbottabad, Pakistan. The raid was a monumental victory, a moment of national catharsis. But in the shadowy world of special operations, victory often comes with a price. There was a palpable fear of retaliation, a sense that the enemy would be looking for a way to strike back, to even the score. It was in this tense, supercharged atmosphere that Bryan Nichols prepared for another night flight into the mountains of Afghanistan. The date was August 6, 2011. The location was the Tangi Valley in the Wardak province of Afghanistan. The Tangi Valley was a notoriously dangerous place, a known sanctuary for Taliban fighters. It was a place where the terrain itself was an enemy, a narrow, winding choke point surrounded by high ridges, a perfect place for an ambush. A mission was launched to capture or kill a senior Taliban leader named Qari Tahir. A team of Army Rangers had flown in under the cover of darkness and engaged in a fierce firefight. They had succeeded in their primary objective, but as they were preparing to leave, they learned that several other key Taliban fighters, including Tahir's associates, were attempting to escape. A quick reaction force, or QRF, was needed, and it needed to be deployed immediately to cut off their escape route. This is where Extortion 17 comes in. The call sign Extortion 17 referred to the specific MH-47D Chinook helicopter that would carry this QRF. The men scrambling to get on board were a veritable who's who of the American Special Operations community. There were 17 members of the U.S. Navy SEALs, most of them from the Naval Special Warfare Development Group, popularly known as SEAL Team 6. 15 of these men were from Gold Squadron, the same squadron that had been instrumental in the bin Laden raid just 3 months prior. It's important to clarify, however, that none of the SEALs on board Extortion 17 had been part of the direct assault team in Abbottabad, though they were part of the same elite unit. Alongside the SEALs were 5 other Naval Special Warfare personnel, including a bomb disposal technician and a cryptologist. There were also 3 Air Force Special Operations troops, a combat controller, and 2 pararescue men. And to provide security on the ground, a team of Afghan commandos and an interpreter were also on the flight. In the cockpit were the men who held all these lives in their hands. The crew from the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment. The pilot in command was Bryan Nichols' good friend and colleague, Chief Warrant Officer 4 David R. Carter. Bryan, despite his immense seniority, was acting as the co-pilot, or pilot in the right seat. This wasn't uncommon. Crews were often mixed and matched based on availability and mission requirements. On this night, 2 of the most experienced pilots in the regiment were flying together. They were joined by a crew chief, Specialist Spencer Duncan, and 2 door gunners, Sergeant Patrick Hamburger and Sergeant Alexander Bennett. In total, there were 38 men on board Extortion 17, 30 Americans and 8 Afghans. The mission was hastily planned. The urgency to intercept the escaping Taliban fighters meant that some of the usual painstaking planning processes were compressed. The Rangers on the ground were calling for support, and the men of Extortion 17 were answering that call. Extortion 17 lifted off and headed towards the Tangi Valley. The flight was short, only a few minutes. From the cockpit, Bryan and David Carter would have been looking through their night vision goggles. The world outside bathed in an ethereal green glow. They were flying low and fast, hugging the contours of the unforgiving terrain. Down below in the valley, a group of Taliban fighters was waiting. They had been alerted to the presence of the American forces and were prepared. According to subsequent investigations, a small team of fighters had taken up a position on the southern side of the valley. They were armed with rocket-propelled grenades or RPGs. They had chosen their position well in a dilapidated two-story building that gave them a clear line of sight into the valley. As Extortion 17 approached its intended landing zone, it slowed down and began its final approach. This is the most vulnerable moment for any helicopter. It's low, it's slow, and it's a large target. At approximately 2:38 a.m. local time, as the Chinook descended, 2 or 3 RPGs were fired from the building. One of them found its mark. The RPG struck one of the Chinook's rear rotor blades. The impact was catastrophic. A blade separation on a tandem rotor helicopter like the Chinook is an unrecoverable event. The massive spinning rotor blades instantly went out of balance, tearing the rear pylon and the rest of the aircraft apart in a matter of seconds. The entire helicopter, laden with men, fuel, and equipment, plunged from the sky. It crashed into a dry riverbed and was immediately consumed by a massive fireball. There were no survivors. The silence that followed the explosion was deafening. On the command nets, the call sign Extortion 17 went unanswered. The Rangers on the ground, who had been waiting for their reinforcements, could only watch in horror. In a single moment, 38 men were gone. It was the single deadliest loss of American life in the entire war in Afghanistan. The news of the crash sent a shockwave through the United States military, particularly the tight-knit Special Operations community. These weren't just soldiers. They were the best of the best. Each man was the product of years of grueling training and combat experience. The loss of 17 SEALs in one incident was devastating, a blow from which the naval special warfare community would take years to recover. The loss of the elite Air Force operators and the 5 Night Stalkers, including 2 of the regiment's most senior pilots, was equally catastrophic. Back home, families were woken in the dead of night by the 2 uniformed officers at the door, the notification that every military family dreads. In Kansas, the Nichols family received the news that Bryan was gone. The quiet, steady presence that had been the bedrock of their family had been extinguished in a valley halfway around the world. The pain was unimaginable, a private grief that was suddenly thrust into the national spotlight. The loss of so many elite operators in a single event inevitably led to questions, and with those questions came controversy. The official narrative was that it was a tragic but straightforward shoot-down, a lucky shot by the Taliban. But for many of the families, and for some within the military and intelligence communities, that explanation felt too simple. Several debates and alternative interpretations emerged. One of the most prominent centered on the rules of engagement. Why were armed escort aircraft, like an AC-130 gunship, not used to suppress the landing zone before the Chinook went in? The official investigation stated that the commanders on the scene made a judgment call that pre-assault fire was not necessary and could have compromised the mission by alerting the enemy. However, critics argued that in a known hot zone like the Tangi Valley, failing to prep the LZ was a fatal mistake. Another area of intense debate focused on the Chinook itself. The MH-47D was an older model. While it had been upgraded for special operations, some argued that it lacked some of the more advanced defensive systems of the newer G model. Was it the right aircraft for such a high-risk mission? Then there were the darker, more conspiratorial theories. Some claimed that the mission was a deliberate trap, that the Taliban had been fed information and were waiting for the SEALs as an act of revenge for the bin Laden raid. This theory was fueled by the fact that the Afghan commandos who were on the flight were, according to some reports, last-minute additions, and their identities were not known to the American team. The official investigation found no evidence of a leak or a conspiracy, concluding that the Taliban fighters who shot down the helicopter were in the valley as part of the ongoing firefight and seized an opportunity. The RPG team, they concluded, likely had no idea who was on board the helicopter. They just saw a large, valuable target. The families of the fallen, desperate for answers, pushed for further investigations. They felt that the official report was incomplete, that it was designed to protect high-ranking officials from accountability. They pointed to inconsistencies in the timeline, questions about the chain of command, and the unsettling fact that the black box of the helicopter had been washed away in a flash flood shortly after the crash, preventing a full analysis of the final moments in the cockpit. What can we learn from a story like this? We learn that heroes are not always the ones who fire the shots. Sometimes they are the ones who fly the aircraft, who calmly guide their precious cargo through the darkness, trusting in their skill and their machine. Bryan Nichols was a hero not for how he died, but for how he lived. He lived a life of quiet professionalism, of service, and of dedication to his craft and to the men who depended on him. He represented the thousands of support personnel, the pilots, the crew chiefs, the medics, the communicators, who are the backbone of the Special Operations Forces. Their names are rarely known and their stories are rarely told, but without them, the missions we read about in the headlines would never happen. Perhaps the most striking and little-known fact about that night is what it represented for Bryan. At 47, with a career spanning nearly 3 decades, he had every right to be back home, teaching the next generation of pilots from the safety of a classroom. But he was there, in the cockpit, in the fight. Why? Because that's who he was. Night Stalkers don't quit. He was there for his crew, for the men in the back, and for the mission. He was finishing his last tour the way he had conducted his entire career, leading from the front. One quote from a fellow Night Stalker, speaking after Bryan's death, encapsulates it all. He said, "Bryan was the guy you wanted to fly with, not because he was a daredevil, but because he wasn't. He was methodical, he was calm, and you knew no matter what happened, he had already thought through it 3 times. Flying with him was like having an insurance policy." When we look up at the sky now and see a helicopter pass overhead, perhaps we can think of him. Perhaps we can remember that inside that complex machine of metal and wire is a human heart, a person with a story, a family, and a purpose. And perhaps, for a brief moment, we can offer a silent thank you to the quiet professionals like Bryan Nichols, the guardians in the sky who fly into the darkness so that others might see the dawn. His legacy is not written in the flames of a crash, but in the thousands of safe landings that came before it, and in the memory of a life lived with honor, skill, and a quiet, unshakable courage. That's a wrap for today's video. If you enjoyed it, smash that like button, drop us a comment below, and don't forget to subscribe so you'll never miss our new content. Thanks for watching.